me summarize. Really smart, really accomplished, and really interesting. Ladies and gentlemen, Samantha Medlock. My pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that gracious introduction, and it's an honor to be with you all this morning. And indeed, I speak with you for the first time in my capacity as a private citizen. So I am a former advisor, a former state and local official, and a former advisor in the White House, but I speak with you as a taxpayer and as a member of my community and as a practitioner on these issues. I'll be focused my remarks mainly on the business case for resilience, and I think that that can be particularly helpful to us. Truly, no matter the outcome in November, we faced an unprecedented and unsustainable approach to risk and how we deal with climate change in the nation. Now, with this outcome, the role of state and local governments, the role of the private sector is going to be even more important. But there are opportunities that we have to continue a trend of leadership in Washington on these issues. So that'll focus some of my remarks as well. The business case is clear, though, with sea levels on the rise, wildfire seasons that now run year-round, drought that threatens our food security and the availability of fresh water, and obviously the increasing frequency and severity of extreme precip events, these rain bomb events that are causing devastating flash flooding inland as well. The public costs of climate change continue to rise. And yet, we've seen over the years the role of state and local governments, of regional entities, of the tribes in better identifying these risks, communicating those risks to their local populations, and acting on it in a way that's locally acceptable and reflects the fabric of concern in a local community will continue to be the trend going forward. But I think what's also important is to look at the way that federal policy and practice can be supporting or perhaps inhibiting that local innovation and leadership. So we see with even military bases and Kennedy Space Center and other major federal facilities, the impacts of climate change impacting budgets as well. So in short, climate change is already costing taxpayers. And the costs that we're already incurring today, though, are anticipated to be dwarfed by the costs that we could be facing going forward. Just looking at the National Flood Insurance Program, going forward toward the end of this century, we can expect the size of floodplains to go up by as much as 40 to 45%. We can expect the number of policies in the National Flood Insurance Program to as much as double. The loss averages for each one of those policies to as much as double, continuing to drive up premiums. Additionally, we can expect the wildfire cost and efforts to suppress wildfire to as much as triple. We are looking at crop insurance premiums and federal subsidies that allow farmers to pay those premiums to increase by nearly half. And illnesses related to poor air quality could prompt billions in additional federal health care spending every year and annual federal disaster relief spending related to tropical storms and hurricanes going up by tens of billions of dollars. So this is an issue that affects each one of us and will translate into devastating impacts on GDP for nations around the world, and reduce annual global economic output by as much as 4% by 2100. And if 4% sounds like a manageable figure, it's important to consider that that represents actually hundreds of billions of dollars in lost annual revenue here in the United States, at a time when we need that revenue more than ever, with infrastructure costs only going up and aging infrastructure across the nation, whether it's transportation, water, or the electrical grid. So this is not the time to be burdening a federal treasury with significant additional costs, and yet that is what unabated climate change is anticipated to provide. So more work is necessary to continue the achievements that we've seen over the course of the last 8 years in the Obama administration, we have seen significant advancements in our ability to measure these risks and quantify and monetize these risks and translate that information into improved standards. I'll speak about that a little bit more with more specificity and give you one of the first big takeaways from my talk this morning related to data and information. But we also need to better be able to inform the underwriting practices across the federal government. When it comes to federal spending, we have a pretty good ability to quantify the costs of a particular policy or a particular project that's been approved by the Congress. We have a pretty good job of being able to know how much it's going to cost us to implement that and get it there. In my old role in the Office of Management and Budget, I was part of teams that did this quantification. And the techniques are very well developed, the methodologies are very robust and mature, and the process is incredibly transparent. However, where we have more work to do is in actually quantifying the benefits of a particular measure or a particular policy. For example, how do we in the federal government or even in state and local budgets differentiate between proposed projects that will provide 100-year level of protection versus 500-year, or even prepare us for climate change? How do we make that difference in how we design a home or a business or a pipeline or a bridge, or how we go about siting and designing wastewater treatment plants? We've got a pretty good idea what it's going to cost, but the challenge is actually measuring the benefits and being able to make those differentiations. So those methodologies are not as well established as they need to be, and we need to be looking to our scientists and economists to come together with those approaches to measuring and then embedding those analyses into how we design federal programs. Increasing community resilience and preparedness is also going to require adjustments in federal programs and practices that currently don't provide local leaders with the incentives that they need to craft sustainable and resilient communities. And yet, we still see state and local governments and tribes leading the way. But we need to get to federal policies that recognize and reward and provide those incentives. Too many local leaders are taking the posture in their land development decisions of rolling the dice with everyone else's money. And that's understandable, right? They're under significant pressures in local governments to make ends meet under much more constrained budget regimes and to do more with less. So it's understandable when a developer is approaching them and offering tax base and offering jobs that they may prefer to roll the dice and hope that the major flood events or major wildfires or drought don't hit during their time in office. But there's another side to this, right? They also can count on, they believe, significant federal assistance to come through in the event that their luck runs out. But careful study of the national debates around federal disaster relief reveals an important shift toward questions of whether some of the harms that communities suffer are actually self-inflicted wounds. It took 90 days for the Congress to approve a $60 billion disaster relief package for Sandy. Taxpayer advocates and other fiscal conservatives may be asking why it's the responsibility of taxpayers across the nation to rebuild communities that have not used best available data to inform their land use decisions. Instead, there's a drive to build stronger after a disaster and to ensure that recipients of public disaster assistance are committed to being the responsible stewards of that investment. State and local governments are the first and last line of defense on climate change and have been taking those steps to mitigate and adapt for a generation. And that's why the President stood up the State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force on Climate Preparedness, a bipartisan team of 26 governors, mayors, county leaders, and tribal leaders to advise the federal government on what they most need to enable their own innovation and leadership. It's been an honor to see two members of that team, Governor Martin O'Malley and also Mayor Jim Brainerd. here who contributed incredible insights into the deliberations of that task force and culminated in a report with very specific recommendations on how the federal policies and programs can adjust to best support that local innovation. And that has been moving forward in 3 key areas. First, providing new data, new mapping and tools to inform community planning and disaster recovery, and also technical assistance, like the Resilience AmeriCorps, to support local approaches that are tailored to community practices and priorities, and modernizing federal programs to provide those incentives for local action to increase standards and reduce vulnerability to extreme weather and other effects of climate change. We also have focused on advancing those tools through collaboration with the private sector. So among the recommendations that we received from that task force was to coordinate more closely in partnership with the insurance industry, and then also to address the nation's vulnerability specifically to flood. So 2 of the actions that we have taken present opportunities for everyone in this room to engage and rise to a call to action. First, on the flood risk management standard, this is the first advancement in flood policy that we've seen in a generation. So while state and local governments have adopted approaches that move beyond the so-called 100-year floodplain, the federal government continued to use this 100-year or 1% annual chance floodplain, and even rebuilding disaster after disaster, putting people right back in harm's way. So through Executive Order 13690 and the flood standard, we see a response not just to Sandy, but also to Hurricane Katrina and to the 1993 Midwest floods and to flood disasters on inland river systems and on coastal systems in response to conversations that frankly began in the 1970s. So this is not merely an Obama-era climate policy. This is about reducing the future risks and costs of floods, burdening local communities and burdening taxpayers. So stay tuned and be watching for opportunities as across the federal government, departments and agencies go about implementing their responsibilities under that executive order. First out of the gate was FEMA, next out of the gate was HUD, but we're looking forward to agencies across the federal government like the Small Business Administration that moves tremendous amounts of federal credit in the wake of a disaster, the Department of Transportation, the EPA, Army Corps of Engineers, and those that help oversee infrastructure to make sure that when we build it strong, and when we rebuild it after a disaster, we apply the lessons learned. But the opportunities to comment on these policies are absolutely critical. And that brings me to the first important takeaway here. In my career over the years, whether it was with local government or with nonprofit organizations, I had the opportunity to look at postings in the Federal Register for draft rules and prepare comments. And I often wondered, as I wrote those, are they really going to be read? Is anybody really going to look at this and actually consider the perspectives of a small town in Texas, or a group of practitioners who are concerned about this particularly nerdy nuance of federal policy? I can tell you, having spent 3 years in the White House and working very closely on the formulation of these policies, every single one of those comments matter. It's read, it's deliberated over exhaustively. And particularly when it comes from professionals, when it comes from state and local leaders, when it comes from our corporate partners, but when it comes from an individual who is raising their voice and expressing concern, it matters. So please keep an eye on the Federal Register. And when you see something and you ask yourself, is it worth me taking the time to read through this and educate myself and raise my voice? The answer I give you is yes. Not only should you, but you have a responsibility to do that. This is part of being an informed electorate, and we don't see as much of that as we should. So I'm going to conclude and get into some Q&A with a strategic action agenda. because we do have an obligation to invest wisely, and 2017 presents important opportunities to support those resilience policies. We talked about the flood standard. Additionally, this year, Congress will reauthorize the National Flood Insurance Program. It's due to expire by September. I find it difficult to believe that anyone in Washington will want to interrupt the free flow of real estate transactions by allowing that program to lapse. So between now and September, there will unfold a national dialogue on flood risk in this country. And it's very important to be weighing in and considering how we go about mapping, including future conditions. How do we address affordability of flood insurance for low and moderate income policyholders? And how do we, at long last, apply the lessons of Hurricane Katrina and address the growing risk of flood associated with levees and dams? There's also the opportunity to weigh in on an innovation that FEMA is calling the disaster deductible. This is a very specific incentive to states that establishes a predetermined formula based on state capacity and other equity factors, but actually serves to reward states that have shown leadership and chosen to get out ahead of risk. Some of the measures that might get recognition in a disaster deductible program could be the adoption of statewide building codes, the consistent enforcement of those building codes. It saves lives, it reduces risks, and in the wake of a disaster, rebuilding stronger using modern code can actually help buy down risk and even reduce insurance cost, putting money back in the pockets of policyholders. It can also look at things like state-level hazard mitigation and disaster resilience funds. Wouldn't we as taxpayers, right, prefer to invest in the disaster recovery of a state that has demonstrated their commitment to be good stewards of that investment by capitalizing their own statewide disaster relief funds? And also promoting the use of private insurance for states to reduce dependence on federal disaster assistance. Without question, insurance pays more quickly, it supports a more complete and compassionate recovery, and as a lawyer, for every insured, that is one less potential litigant, that is one less potential person in line for federal disaster relief, and one less person that is suffering, unable to rebuild or get back to work or get their kids back in school because they are waiting for Congress to act after 90 days. So these policy opportunities rely on stakeholder participation, including states, local governments, taxpayers, and private sector leaders, and they will benefit from an informed and engaged media, providing reliable and factual information. So action number one, use your voice. Comments matter. Voice concerns and help policymakers get it right. We don't have all the answers in Washington. We need your help to get it right. But also reinforce a good policy or approach. If something is in a proposed rule that works well, give it that voiced support, because through the final process, it may not survive. I would also say, action number two, engage in reasoned discourse. Challenging others' assumptions and being prepared to be challenged in turn. Be accountable for what you forward, retweet, or like. Practice and teach critical thinking, and allow for the possibility that you may change your mind if you're presented with persuasive facts and a reasoned argument. And lastly, make resilience and preparedness part of the American society. We need to make resilience and preparedness sexy. Part of this is looking at opportunities like the America's Prepare-a-thon. Every April 30th and the entire month of September, there is a grassroots campaign that has been initiated by FEMA. This should continue into the next administration and encourage families to make a plan and assemble supplies for themselves so that they can self-sustain for 72 hours. A week would be better. Confirm adequate insurance coverage and documenting all of their belongings. And employers, this goes to you too. Assess the preparedness of your company, of your facility, and your workforce. We need only look at the experiences of Katrina and Sandy when small businesses were interrupted. On average, if a small business has to close its doors for 4 days, it has a 50% chance of never reopening. So it is important for employers to also get into the game and make resilience and preparedness part of the corporate ethos as well. I'm going to wrap up there because I do want to try to reserve some time for questions, but I thank you all again so much, and it's been a real privilege to get to speak with you as a citizen.